everyone. This is Cureton from XR Today, senior journalist, and we're bringing you the latest and greatest from the XR, AR, and VR industries. Thanks for joining us today, and today we have on Mr. Yoyo Munk. Can you tell us a little bit about your role and what exactly you do with Tindrum? This is a fascinating company that I've just recently come across.
Sure. Tindrum is a studio that primarily works with mixed reality as a medium. And I serve as, technically my role is the chief science officer for Tindrum, but that generally means that I fulfill a lot of technical roles within bringing all of our pieces to life. Most recently, I was the director for the piece that we put on at the V&A as part of the London Design Festival entitled Medusa. So this was the first time that I've really been sitting in the director's chair for one of our pieces, formally.
Brilliant. Yeah, and it was a very serendipitous moment, I suppose. Like when I walked into the V&A, it was just something I wanted to do for that Saturday. And I saw those glasses being put on everyone, and I was like, there's a story here. We have to cover it. So
I'm glad you dropped by. Yeah.
Yeah, so many thanks for you and your staff for allowing me to, I guess, gate crash and, see what it had to offer, because it was absolutely impressive.
Oh, fantastic. I'm delighted to hear it.
Okay, thanks so much. We're going to actually get into it, and we're going to go a bit further into, the nuts and bolts of the entire exhibition, as well as more that Tindrum does, behind the scenes. So let's get started. Can you tell us about the collaboration that you had with Fujimoto on the Medusa installation? For you, what was the journey and the process that was taken to build this visual masterpiece? What I consider a visual masterpiece.
Oh, you flatter me. That's wonderful to hear. The idea for this piece really started with a chance meeting between the CEO of Tindrum, Todd Eckert, and Ben Evans, who is the chair of the London Design Festival. And we were working as Tindrum with mixed reality as a medium at the time, and they struck up a conversation about the idea of doing a piece of architecture within mixed reality and what it would essentially mean to have an architectural experience without a physical form. So no physical structure, just glasses providing a sense of space ripe for exploration. The world got very interesting in the last 2.5 years or so, and so some of our more immediate plans had to be put on a little bit of ice. But we decided that the time was right earlier this year, and Ben facilitated the connection between us and Sue Fujimoto's atelier in Paris. And so around May of this year, we began collaborating in earnest with, in particular, two architects at the Paris atelier, Barbara Stallone and Francisco Silva, and also Adrian de la Sens there. And the initial set of conversations really were a back and forth during lockdown kind of environment where we had the experience in terms of what mixed reality is like as a medium and where its constraints are and what it does well and what it doesn't do so well. And that's the sort of thing that's often easiest to actually be able to physically demonstrate to folks. But because we were all under lockdown at the time, it was very difficult for us we couldn't really travel and sort of showcase things easily. And so a lot of this really had to sort of emerge out of a set of back and forth conversations in which we talked fairly broadly about the potential for the medium and ways and the sorts of things that we thought could work well and the other sorts of things that we thought would not work so well. And then the atelier would come to us with a series of concept ideas and sets of slides and sketches for things that they thought might be interesting. And we'd kind of go through them and sort of evaluate them based on whether or not they would work well within the limited medium that we had available to us. We sort of philosophically really connected around this early idea of really wanting to lean into this idea of architecture without form. There's the old sort of Louis Sullivan maxim about form follows function, which is usually an expression that is used to guide the emphasis on the utilitarianism of form, and sort of saying that like avoiding decoration for its own sake and allowing the function of the piece to sort of like inform the aesthetics. And when you start talking about a piece of architecture that doesn't have a physical form and is completely unburdened of any kind of utilitarian requirements, like, this doesn't have to be a structure that can support humans or shelter humans or do anything except for exist and as a space for exploration, that allows you to kind of think, okay, if form is going to follow function in this case, now we need to think about what the function is if it's not really a structure that's designed to provide shelter. And obviously, architecture provides a multitude of functions. It's not just about separating us from elements or providing a roof over the head or so forth. There's also a distinct emotional characteristic that embodies the structures that we move through. And the way that spaces make us feel as collectives of humans that inhabit them is unquestionably part of its function. And by taking out the physical form entirely, this allowed us to really try to sort of lean into the emotional characteristics of space and how creating an environment that is designed for the that is designed to be inhabited by a collective of humans who might be total strangers to one another, and facilitate a kind of connection between them that is informed by the nature of the space that surrounds them, was really the goal that we sort of settled on fairly early on, in terms of like how we were going to inform the shape of the space, as well as the kinds of ideas that we wanted to embody within the structure.
Yeah, good response, Steffa. Okay. So yeah, we got going deeper into it. We talk a little bit about the the centerpiece, which is Medusa. So I remember putting on the glasses, the smart glasses, and walking around the VA museum, and I think that was maybe my second AR exhibition. After another one known by a street artist known I think his name is Mexer, but this one was like the full scale one that I've been able to check out, and I think that this one really impressed because I think it was partly the backdrop and some of the themes that were encompassed in the entire artwork. So I guess I'd let you explain a bit more, as you and Mr. Fujimoto were able to come together and design this one. Like, what do you think was the overall theme behind Medusa? And also, why was the V&A chosen as the backdrop for this mixed reality art space?
Of course, yeah. So there were a number of themes that we were really excited about with regards to what was going to be embodied within the full structure of Medusa. And I think at the core of that was really a desire to examine the complexity of the relationship between architecture and nature. You'll find plenty of folks who will sort of say that they find inspiration in nature, whether they come from design or architecture and so forth, and that's often used at a fairly sort of superficial aesthetic level, which is not necessarily to say that that's. I mean, you can create beauty and form through like observing nature and trying to sort of like filter that through the lens of human perception. And using that to inform the structures that we then bring into our worlds. And there is unquestionably value in providing that sort of sense of inspiration and beauty and the way that this connection to the outside that might otherwise be lost within purely human structures. But there's also there's a darker side to this relationship, which is that our human architecture typically exists at the expense of natural structures. When we build our structures, we build them and we usually displace existing ecosystems, and we have caused a great reduction in the natural structures and all of the architectures that are non-human in the world, for the sake of creating our own architecture for us to embody. And so one of the desires with this piece was really to like examine the complexity of that relationship between human architecture and nature at both an aesthetic level, but also trying to go a little bit deeper and create a space that is explicitly about the displacement and destruction of natural structures for the sake of human architecture. And so, and where that really sort of relates to human architecture is that, I mean, at the core of any piece of human architecture, there's a story. And that story is really this notion that there is such a thing as the inside and the outside. That, like, we build these structures, and now this is inside. Humans go in here, and, like, this is our space, and, like, what's outside is out there. And that's never really been a true story. It's always just been that same biosphere, the same kind of connection of living forms. And, like, humans have always really been a part of that structure. But we got very kind of romantically attached to this idea that we exist outside of nature, that, like, our technology, that our ability to shape the forms of shelter and so forth in the world, and this ability to replace existing ecosystems with spaces that we've designed for our own use, has really kind of really lies as the soul of, like, what a lot of architecture is about. And having internalized that story, we've really kind of arrived at a point in the history of our species where we are entering into an era where we are essentially going to be forced collectively to come to terms with the consequences of that story. It hasn't been true this whole time. And now we're reaching a point where we are really going to spend the rest of our time on this planet trying to work our way through the consequences that have built up over time as a result of that story. And so the idea of being able to use the Raphael court, I mean, they're very simple answers that, like, when the universe throws the opportunity to create a piece inside of the Raphael court at the Victoria and Albert Museum, you do everything you absolutely can in order to make that happen. And so it was something that was offered as part of the association with the LDF. And as soon as it was on the table, we just kind of jumped on it and was like, we have to do this. But it also fits thematically with the piece in a way that I really became quite fond of by the time we got in there. In that, Raphael as an artist was really the height of the High Renaissance, and this was a time for art in which there was really this pure celebration of the grandeur of human accomplishment. This was this idea that, like, that there was just magnificence in what humans could create. And, like, the idea that you have these masterpieces by Raphael in this space that mimics the structure and form of the Sistine Chapel essentially means that, like, the real world backdrop against which we are displaying this work is essentially a physical monument to human grandeur that feels like it is from a time before we've truly internalized or had even any concept of, like, what the eventual consequences of that solipsism and narcissism at the collective level would ultimately create for us. And so we kind of have this non-existent piece of architecture inside the room that is shared between the people wearing the headsets in the space, that is designed to be reflective of a spectrum of natural structures, with this backdrop of this extraordinary backdrop that contextualizes this work within the grander space of how humans have sought to elevate our own self-perception.
No, right. Well said. Well said. I noticed how the art forms were interacting with the people. It was almost like it was swallowing them whole. And I guess a spoiler alert for anyone else who's going to see the exhibition. But it was just very compelling. I was trying to piece together some of the symbolism behind it, and of course, Medusa being involved in that—that's the ossification of those who look upon those things. And I was always a big fan of Greek history back when I was in uni days and so on. But yeah,
Of course, yeah. So I mean, like the ossification part. I mean, one of the things that we were really playing with here was this idea of physical, or this sense of physicality without physical form. And so, like, Medusa as a mythological feature, as a mythological figure, to gaze upon her, like, to allow the light that was reflected from that structure into your eyes was to be physically transfigured. And so, like, it was kind of this way of nodding to this idea of creating this sense of physical space, like the idea that there is this thing that is there and it's swallowing people, or like, moving around them and kind of and inhabiting this space. But it's constructed entirely out of light. Like, there's no real solidity to it. It's only in how it's perceived that creates that sense of solidity.
Right. Lovely. Yeah, we can move on to, I guess, the more technical side of it, I guess, the nuts and bolts of the whole, design and structure and everything. So I want to jump to this question. So when I went to the museum and I saw the exhibit, they told me that the headsets were Nreal, and Nreal is one of our, sponsored companies that we work with, and so I was very impressed by that. Now, for you, what kind of technology was necessary to create this exhibit, and why did you choose, for example, Nreal as the hardware provider for it?
Okay, yeah. I mean, so we're obviously in fairly early days for augmented reality stereoscopic headsets, and so I mean, I think one of the first questions there would be like, why go for a set of glasses as opposed to a tablet-based AR experience, given that that would generally be the way that a lot of people would choose to do AR. And I think that one of the themes that we wanted to connect with most of all was this idea that the transparent form of the glasses essentially like reduces the barrier between you and the other people inside of the space. Like, it's deliberately not this. It's not supposed to be this isolated, solitary experience. Like, the way that you explore this space and the way that you inhabit this is, whether you're conscious of it or not, is informed by how you're observing other people within the space that are sharing the same structure with you. And by not having that, as soon as you put a screen in front of people, this is sort of like a familiar separating device. Like, it's this physical object, even if it's kind of a camera passing through. You're kind of already in this mode switched way of being, where you're sort of like, I'm not really seeing a person anymore. I'm seeing like a potential picture of that person. And so one of the things that I like about mixed reality glasses in general, in addition to all of the usual things about being able to provide additional stereoscopic depth and that sort of like, that tighter connection to sensory perception, it's also just that like it really kind of minimizes the barrier between members of the audience as they're inhabiting the space together. And so even though it's several orders of magnitude more challenging to put on something that involves headset-based AR versus screen-mediated AR, I think the advantages are worth it, just in terms of like how we're able to kind of connect with audiences and build connections between audience members. So then once you say, okay, I would like to use an AR headset, there aren't a ton of options available to you at this point. And we've done projects in the past using the Magic Leap 1. We've done projects using the HoloLens 2. And this is our first time using the Nreal Light. And I would say that for us, specifically in our case, the Nreal is an attractive device for us for a number of reasons. It has a very high quality display. It has a fairly simple optical design, and I'm not saying that to be derogatory towards it. It is a traditional bird bath combiner with a regular mirror on it, and those are great. They've been around for a long time. They work exceptionally well, and like when you put a nice bright micro OLED projector at one end of that chain, you get a very clear, nice image that is quite robust. And when you compare that to the kinds of images that you can get through, say, diffractive waveguides, it is much clearer and sharper and brighter and more color accurate when you're looking through this much simpler optical chain. It is a marvel of optical engineering that these more complex devices with diffractive waveguide optics work at all. They are truly impressive pieces of optical engineering. But I have not seen any evidence yet that we are at the level of sophistication where they are providing a truly exemplary quality display. The other aspects, compared to other options out there, because we tend to run these large exhibitions with large numbers of people, the fact that the Nreal is a detached device from the compute pack, which is a standard Android phone, gives us quite a few options in terms of how we can structure our events. Because when we're running a HoloLens-based display, the whole thing is this monolithic object, and that basically means that when the device inevitably needs to go down to charge, we've lost both the display and the computer. But when we have those things separate, we can essentially have roughly double the number of phones as we have displays, so that we're basically constantly cycling the glasses through the sanitation process and then back in, and we're only cycling out the compute packs, which essentially gives us quite a bit of flexibility on that front. The other things I would say, there's also the rather pedestrian issue of cost. The Nreal is a substantially easier on the wallet object, especially when you're talking about having 70 of them. That makes things much more tractable for us to be able to work with large audiences. And that's always a goal with us, is that we're really sort of trying to push the boundaries of how many people we can get into these spaces, because we can do things that involve 5 people, but that's still a fairly intimate crowd. And the way that people interact with one another and interact with spaces is transformed once you start to get towards a space where once you get above 30 people or so, this is now a collective that has an energy of its own, and it's constantly changing as people enter and leave that space, and it's less defined by any individual contribution to it than what is kind of happening at the meta level between all of the people in the space. So basically, if we can afford to buy more of the devices, then we're able to run larger audiences, and that has advantages to it as well. And the last thing I would say is just that, we make use of a lot of advanced technology in what we do, but we're not really in a space where we're trying to present ourselves as celebratory of technology. We're not trying to do technology for its own sake. And to that end, I think there's an advantage to the familiarity and the form factor of the Nreal glasses. I can hand someone a phone in a pouch, or it's just a black pouch, and technically it contains a phone, but ideally the audience member doesn't actually even realize that part. They hang it around their neck, and I give them a pair of glasses, and they put the glasses on. They've seen glasses before. They're familiar with this as a form factor, and so it lowers that kind of barrier to entry, and they're not really thinking so much about the technology, and have a more direct connection to the work itself. Whereas with a more complex device, you kind of sort of have to go through the whole initial stage of this is the thing, this is how it's going to connect to your head. You're going to have to tighten this bit around here, blah, blah, blah. And so when you specifically want to try and minimize the extent to which people are remaining focused on the technological aspect of it, there's something that is very compelling about having this familiar form factor, even if there's quite a bit of extra technology in there.
Right. Yeah. I noticed when people were walking around, and it's almost equally important to pay attention to the people who are attending the event as it is to the art itself, because it's almost like a reflection of how people perceive it. And Exactly. I even saw some people in parts of it, they were just sitting down together, stargazing at basically the event as it was taking place. And so it was almost shaping those relationships as people were, interacting with one another, moving through, the exhibition and so on. So it was really, really interesting to notice and to watch as well.
Yeah. So, the audience would kind of take on characters of its own. So when people entered the space, and sometimes the audience would be in a fairly kind of passive space and would be sort of like all sitting on the benches that were provided or standing still. And then when someone would enter, they would often feel compelled to say like, okay, I see how everyone in this space is interacting with it right now. And so I'm going to join this kind of collective fabric of people inside of this space. But if it had been a different crowd and everybody had been kind of like wandering around, they might have been compelled to walk instead. And so it's kind of like examining this sort of like nature of like the extent to which our individual concept of like how we move through spaces and that sort of sense of agency that we carry into our exploration of spaces is subconsciously or consciously informed by our perception of how other people are inhabiting that space already and the implicit narrative that joins the people inside that space.
Yeah.
But
nice.
Some people just like to lie out on the ground and kind of like and stare upwards, and like they seemed like they were having a great time. And as soon as one person started lying down on the ground, then a few others would join them.
Yeah.
On the other hand, some folks were like trying to see whether or not they could take a picture of that, with their phone through the lenses of the camera, which, does not work well at all. But as soon as one person tries that, then everybody else wants to give it a go as well. And so you enter into the space where everyone is just very frustratedly trying to take a picture of something through a pair of glasses. And I suspect very few of those pictures came out well.
Right. Yeah. They'll have to remember it.
That's sort of like, the idea is, I think that there's a goal here in the idea that this is deliberately resistant to being sort of like Instagrammable. That this is not about trying to create a space that is one where you kind of like preserve some moment of yourself in it, and is more about trying to sort of like create a space that is inherently ephemeral.
Beautiful. Lovely. Now we'll go on to the last question. This is one that we can get into related to, I guess, Tin Drum, as well as, the rise of AR as a medium of artistic expression. So for you, how does AR compare with other artistic mediums, and why has Tin Drum chosen to promote it, within its firm?
Yeah. I think that there are obvious links between AR as a medium and other media that have come before it. And you can draw on, there are links in what we were trying to do here with like sculpture and architecture. The links to film and the video game industry are ones that are sort of like more obvious touchstones for people who are working inside of AR more generally. I see AR as a medium that has a number of really interesting constraints associated with it. And I am most sort of fascinated with the ways in which the constraints drive creativity. And as soon as you know what you can't really do, that kind of like pushes you in interesting directions about and trying to find ways that you can accomplish things. I would generally sort of say that with regards to AR, much like VR and other forms of interactive media, there's this general sort of like interesting aspect of a kind of trust exercise between the creators of the piece and the audience that's experiencing it, because you're essentially dealing with this kind of free viewpoint space where, if done correctly, or done well, not necessarily correctly, but it allows for this kind of for a creator of spaces to try and create these more sort of like general experiences that are not designed, where you're not imposing a specific vision or any kind of like specific guidelines on how this space must be explored or inhabited. And you're really kind of like entering into this kind of collaborative space between yourself and the audience about like how you're putting things out on the table, and they may or may not choose to take advantage of those things, and they might use those in different ways or take something completely different than what you were thinking about when you put them in. And I think that trust exercise is a really interesting one. I'm drawn to that space because it's one that's really hard to do well. And I think that it's very easy to sort of like get into these kinds of garden path kind of experiences where like, you sort of say like, technically it's interactive, but also there is sort of a right way to do this, or like you have to push this button and then pull this lever kind of thing. And that's sort of less interesting to me because it's just sort of like a puzzle space. But the idea of trying to sort of like arrive at this kind of like a sense of truly collaborative expression in which the audience is as much involved with the creation of what the piece actually is as the person who's like, actually writing the code for it. Like that feels exciting and interesting to me. As for AR, as opposed to things like virtual reality, I'm most interested in. I think that a lot of our journey through technology and interactive modes of storytelling have leaned heavily into these concepts of sort of power fantasies. The emphasis of the individual, essentially like putting you into the sort of into this space where like you can do things that you wouldn't do otherwise, and so forth. But they're essentially these very isolated experiences where you're essentially you're not entering these spaces as yourself. You are kind of entering the spaces as an idealized avatar of how someone else might perceive you, which is a little bit sort of, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It's just that there's also an aspect of it that feels slightly insidious, especially when it comes to like, okay, how do I really connect with other people inside of this space? When you think about sort of like the VR communication channels in which like, people sort of run around with their avatars and wave their hands and so forth, like it is a form of connection, but it's obviously very much filtered through the modality of the medium. Like you're not really connecting with these people, with these humans as humans. It's an entirely different form of connection. And as humans, we've obviously engaged in any number of different kinds of writing a letter to someone is a different kind of connection than talking to them. It's not to say that some kinds of communication are bad versus the other. But I would generally say that, especially when you're thinking about collective spaces and large audiences of people, that there are subtle and unconscious aspects of how people connect with one another that are very difficult to translate through into a limited medium. Like it's much easier just to let people see each other and connect with one another in the normal way, as opposed to trying to sort of say, okay, how can I create an avatar that works inside of this context? And so for creating a piece like Medusa, there's nothing that would necessarily stop you from making a VR version of this. But I would find the idea of, okay, how do I create a space where people can enter into it and feel like they have a human connection with other people as they're exploring this space? I would find that very difficult. And it's quite easy in the AR sense because I don't have to do anything. I simply have to provide the structure, and the fact that people can see each other and interact with each other normally does the rest of the work for me. And I think one of the other things that attracts us at Tyndrum to augmented reality spaces in general is just this idea. There's an excitement that comes with working with an emerging medium. It's fun to get to feel like you're out on the forefront and sort of trying new things. But there's another aspect to it, which is that oftentimes when someone comes to see one of the pieces that we've made, it's their first time trying anything like this before. Like they haven't had a mixed reality experience before. And that means that they're not arriving at this space with any kind of preconditioned notions of what AR is and what they should expect from the experience. The number of people who showed up in the Raphael court, somewhat disappointedly expecting to see an actual physical structure hanging from the ceiling, only to be told that they in fact had to put on a pair of glasses in order to see the thing. There was not really this general sense of okay, I'm going to see a mixed reality thing and I know what this is going to be about and what it's like. And so when you have the opportunity to be someone's first experience with a new kind of medium, there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of responsibility that comes with that, because you're essentially creating that first exposure to the kinds of pieces that can exist within this medium. And it's the sort of thing where, it is going to, you are essentially defining people's, like the preconceptions that people will carry into their future experiences with the medium. And so, I think that, there are many different ways in which people have moved into these emerging media. And I think we're generally interested in using these emerging media to try and create these pieces that are really fundamentally about regaining a sense of human connection that has been eroded by the sort of the individualism that has been pushed through our current era of techno fetishism. This idea of everybody has a rectangle, everybody has their connection. It's all about sort of taking the picture of yourself here, and here. It's created this deep sense of isolation, somewhat paradoxically, through all of the connection that it is theoretically enabled. And so our desire is to try and subvert some of that, leaning into the irony of using technology in order to do it, and create these pieces that are fundamentally less about the tech itself or sort of this exciting medium, and more about how it makes people feel about themselves and about each other, and a feeling that ideally lasts after long after they've taken the glasses off.
Beautiful, lovely. I think when you see people using their devices, their headsets, their mobile phones, anything that they've got that's AR enhanced or enabled, they tend to look at it through the lens of themselves. And I think it's good to have these kinds of art forms that force them to look at, their environment in new lights that are driven by concepts that help them to see things differently outside of the individual self. For me, that's going to be a major wake-up call. So I'm looking forward to seeing any future updates from Tin Drum as well. So yeah, we'll go ahead. We'll wrap it up there. But, it was lovely speaking to you. So this has been...
Likewise.
This has been Yoyo Munk, CTO for Tin Drum, and I am Damon Cureton, senior journalist from XR Today, and it was a pleasure speaking with you, and looking forward to the next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, and for you in the audience, if you've enjoyed this particular conversation, please join us at our Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn pages, and if you'd like to use the XR News hashtag to follow any of our news updates. Once again, we're signing off. Thanks so much for joining this conversation, and have a great day. Bye now.